Greetings and welcome to today's virtual program, In the Life, Queer Black Desire, Imagination, and World Building, presented by the American LGBTQ Museum. My name is Suhaili Bautista Carolina. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a brown-skinned woman with red lipstick. I have on a pink sweater and gold ginkgo-shaped earrings. And I have a blurred background behind me. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Partnerships at the American LGBTQ Museum, a new collaboration dedicated to preserving, researching, and sharing LGBTQ history and culture that will open its first galleries in New York City in 2026. However, we like to say that you do not have to wait until 2026 to experience the queer magic of the American LGBTQ Museum. We are already producing and presenting dynamic public programs such as today's virtual panel, as well as traveling exhibitions centered on LGBTQ history and culture. I encourage you to check us out, follow us on social media, become a founding member, attend a program, and stay engaged as our story continues to unfold. Before we begin, I'd like to share our virtual land acknowledgement. While we are gathered in a virtual space today, we are each tuning in from our respective Indigenous lands. I myself am joining you from present-day New York City, the unceded homeland of the Lenape people. We respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to the territories on which we reside and gather, and we honor the energy and stewardship of these lands by all Indigenous generations, past, present, and future. Today, we will hear from some inspiring panelists who will invite us into a conversation centered on queer Black desire, imagination, and world building. We invite those of you joining us to please enter any questions that you may be holding into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to welcome our panelists and hosts today. Cookie Woolner, historian, professor, and author of the famous Lady Lovers, Black Women and Queer Desire Before Stonewall. Jafari S. Allen, anthropologist, professor, and author of There's a Disco Ball Between Us, A Theory of Black Gay Life. Dr. Kaila Adia Story, professor, and Audre Lorde Endowed Chair of Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Louisville. And our moderator, Josh Rivers, the founder of the award-winning podcast, Busy Being Black. Without further ado, I welcome our panelist and moderator to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much. Hello, I'm Josh Rivers. I'm a brown-skinned man wearing a fabulous pair of Tom Ford glasses and a cerulean cardigan that I did not dig out of a basement bin, but bargain bin. Thank you all for being here, and to the American LGBTQ Museum for the invitation to moderate this conversation with people I admire a great deal. At a time of such protracted violence and distress and displacement, I'm interested in what our queer Black elders and ancestors can teach us about how we build worlds, conjure joy, and sustain resistance. Kevin Kwashi has one of my favorite ever ways of describing what happens in our mind and bringing it into the world, our quote, wild and voluptuous interior lives. So I'm hoping that we can explore how we encourage some of that wild interior voluptuousness out into the public domain, into this world we inhabit together. So before we begin our conversation, we'll open with a question I ask all of my guests on Busy Being Black. How's your heart? Cookie, let's start with you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Hi, Josh. I'm going to just describe myself physically first. I am a white Jewish, middle-aged, fat, cis femme with brown, wavy hair to my shoulders and a black and white dress with some tattoos peeking out on the side, and I have a blurred background behind me. How is my heart? My heart is a bit heavy due to everything that's been going on in the world recently. But I'm very inspired by my students. I teach at the University of Memphis, a public university in the South. And my students are really wonderful, and we're going on a fabulous journey in my women's history class. We just made some Valentine's the other week. I'm gonna actually show you one of my favorite ones. I've got this, oh, it's blurred out, but it says, I'm hooked on bell hooks. So I've been feeling the love from my students kind of post Valentine's Day.
Lovely. And Kaila, how's your heart?
Yes, I'm Kaila, and I'll describe myself. I'm a Black lesbian femme. I have big gold hoops. I have my locks to the side to give the illusion that I've shaved the side of my hair because I love that hairstyle, but I'm actually not quite courageous enough to actually shave it. So I gel it down and put it to the side. Yeah, I'm brown skin. I have on false lashes because that's my thing. I wear them every time I'm in public. And in terms of how's my heart, it feels full and it feels happy, and excited for a conversation. Um, and at the same time, as with Cookie, I feel very, it feels very distressed. I'm in the state of Kentucky, and there are about 14 anti-LGBTQ bills that the legislators have introduced here in this state. There's about 6 different DEI bills that seek to get rid of university programs and anything committed to diversity. So, but I am inspired by my students and larger Louisville community's response to these things. They're activated, they're upset, they're enraged, and they're doing something about it. So they're actively pushing against things. So that makes my heart feel great and good.
Thank you, Kaila. And Jafari. S. Allen, how's your heart?
How's my heart? Well, before I tell you about my heart, I'm Jafari, and I'm the color of a Hershey bar, dark brown and delicious. I'm bald and am wearing big glasses that you can barely see the gold rim, and I have a gray, mostly white, and a little black in my mustache and goatee. In the background is a Wilfredo Lamb painting that I hope gives the illusion that this painting is actually in my living room, but it's just a background. And I'm wearing a white blouse with a big cowl neck that you might imagine an errant, really naughty nun might be wearing. And on my wrist there are 6 silver bangles that belonged from Barbados that belonged to my aunt, indicating that I don't mind sounding like a middle-aged, middle-class Black lady when I walk through the hallway. So my heart is at once full, and in Black American vernacular of a full heart, that there's wonderful things happening, and I'm fed by conversations, by experiences, by teaching, by love, and also very, very heavy with everything that's happening in the world and in my own personal worlds. But that combination of the fullness of the heaviness helps me to move through. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here with all of you, and thank you again for that question, Josh.
Thank you all. And I extend that question as well to our guests. Feel free to tell us how your heart is in the chat, and we'd love to see and read how you're feeling. It's obviously Black History Month, but Black History Month is also LGBTQ History Month. And Cookie, I'm interested in disruptions to the dominant narrative of Stonewall as the singular and defining spark of the modern LGBTQ liberation movement. In many ways, the story of the Stonewall Uprising actually flattens the complicated and entangled movements that long precipitated the proverbial brick throwing. How does your book, The Famous Lady Lovers, help us understand LGBTQ liberation in new ways?
Ooh, what a wonderful question. Thank you for asking. Yeah, so my book focuses on the 1920s and 30s, mostly looking at cities like New York and Chicago, and looking at the new subcultures and identities and queer worlds that Black queer women are making at this time, both women performers such as Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, Ethel Waters, and also a lot of everyday women I kind of discovered in the archives, in Black newspapers, in Vice reports and places like that. And so while many of these women didn't yet, have like LGBTQ identities, right, in the modern way that we do and have similar social movements, I mean, they were still part of larger arts and culture movements such as, the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro movement. I look at not only performers, but also educators, women like Lucy Diggs Slow, who was the first dean of women at Howard University, who lived off campus with her partner, the playwright Mary Burrell. So really in the 20s and 30s, decades before Stonewall, we see all these amazing Black queer women who are leaders in their fields, whether in the arts or in education, who are, in this moment of not only Jim Crow repression and discrimination, but also the kind of pathologized, I can't even say it. This is a moment when queerness is being pathologized, right, more than ever. They're still, boldly living their lives, meeting each other and flirting on the street in speakeasies, right? So we can really see that Black queer history has this really, really long history way before Stonewall, right? Which I think can be really inspirational. And one other thing I'll just say is that women in my book, such as Gladys Bentley, there were no white equivalents of these women in the 20s and 30s, right? Like Black queer culture was American queer culture in this time. And I think students especially need to learn this.
Come on now, Black queer culture.
Okay, I think we're gonna
Baby,
we're gonna need you to say that again and make T-shirts, please.
Wow.
Whereas,
Yeah. Black queer culture was American queer culture. Of course, William Dorsey Swann is the first documented person to be arrested in protest of LGBTQ rights in the United States. And for those who don't know, William Dorsey Swann was a formerly enslaved person who hosted these fabulous balls and gatherings in Washington, D.C., and was arrested so many times. Two things stand out to me, Cookie. It's one, the everyday Black queer women who you discovered as part of this archive, and this ongoing curiosity I have, or this kind of, I'm drawn to people and these ideas around how we resist in the quotidian, right? Because change is always so big and so momentous. And I think that we often, in this kind of change and liberation movement, we obscure the fact that like every single day people make the decision to get out of bed. And that one act, that one quotidian decision actually snowballs into this bigger thing. I mean, what stands out to you about what you've learned from some of these more everyday, if you will, Black queer women from that time?
Yeah, my book starts with a story of a woman who lives in a Chicago boarding house with her girlfriend, and she just made the decision to leave her husband for her. She'd known this woman earlier. They're actually both from Paducah, Kentucky, and then they met again in Chicago. And so just, this one, and I've just found this one short newspaper article about it, and I'm able to kind of, but they even go as far as to say like, oh, just this one case of a woman divorcing her husband to live with another woman, does this herald a new sex problem in the North? So just this like one brave example then becomes seen as this larger problem, right? But it just shows the power of really what you're saying, like these individual actions people make and the way they can be seen as really kind of furthering liberation for them, even though other people see it as a problem, right?
Kaila, the Stonewall's legacy, I think, has other, or its co-option rather, has other impacts and legacies, which often show up in your classroom. Can you talk about how the legacy of Stonewall informs who your students understand as beneficiaries of Stonewall's legacy?
Yeah, no, certainly. I've been teaching my Intro to LGBTQ Studies class since I got to U of L in 2007. And I created the course so we could eventually create the LGBTQ Studies minor that we launched in 2009. And I kept being blown away by one, my students who were queer or trans, non-binary. One, they didn't see me as queer. So that was the initial thing, was they didn't really see me as queer, as like, students would say, like, well, why are you teaching the intro class? And I'm like, well, because I created it. And it's like, well, and I'm like, well, I'm a lesbian, like, and so then I just made it a practice to announce my identity and announce who I was in my classroom, to say like I'm a Black lesbian femme. This is when I came out or invited others in, like telling this whole journey, because I was being viewed by my students, and they were all different races too. But I was being viewed as this kind of Black woman professor, but not a Black lesbian professor, and then also not having any relationship to LGBTQ people or communities, or I guess to myself. And so once I started teaching about Stonewall, and I started teaching about anything that led up to it, like Compton Cafe riots and all of the other kind of protests that predate Stonewall, they would be blown away and fascinated that there was this coalition building that was multiracial, that was intersectional, that was like, there was an interclass dynamic happening. They just were really, really blown away. They thought the architects of the resistors, the agitators, were all these cis white gay men. And that's for them, who are queer themselves, they were getting ideas of queerness historically from media, I guess, just television or TV shows, films. And I guess they were avoiding things like Moonlight and like anything by Ian Patrick Polk, because I'm like, huh? Like, y'all ain't never heard of Ian Patrick Polk and the Skinny? But there was like this direct avoidance of any kind of Black queer or Black LGBT visibility. And they were open to it. I mean, once they learned and understood, they were really open to it and wanting to know, like, so Vogue isn't just from Madonna, or saying things like sachet or shade or reading, like these things aren't from RuPaul. Like RuPaul's not the complete architect of all these things. So it was a disconnect that was happening. And I hopefully am doing a good job of trying to paint a broader, bigger picture of what LGBT life and queer life meant to those past folks, me, right? Who's also this kind of elder now, the students just keep getting younger and younger. And so like, I'm this gay elder, and I live for it. But yeah, I think that was some of I was really surprised, even though for myself, who had been like kind of sneaking in gay bars since I was like 16 with my fake ID and all of this, like I had dealt with like racial microaggressions in these queer spaces. But I was really blown away that my students' reaction to that, the history around queer liberation was so multifaceted and so much bigger than what they thought it would be or was.
I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, but one of the Black women I work with, we've known each other for a very long time, and I innocently asked her a question about, moving through the world as a lesbian, and she was like, "Josh, I'm a Black woman." Like, no one assumes that I'm a lesbian. Like, like that homophobia is not something I'm experiencing directly. And that was like kind of really watershed moment for me, and thinking differently about how sexuality and gender and race kind of merge and and show up or are read in people. So we know that teaching is a transformative profession, and that all of you, will have such a profound impact in the lives of so many people. But Kaila, who has transformed you as part of this process? Like, what has surprised you most about your students, and how have they transformed your process, your teaching process?
They've done, I mean, each set of students, each groups of students change and alter. I feel like for the most part, they also teach me. Like, my students introduced me to concepts of polyamory and different relationship models that were happening within the queer community that I was just unaware of, as, what they say, "Oh, doc, you're an old gay. You don't know none." You know what I mean? And that's what they'll tell me, like, to my face, to like, "You're just an old gay and you do that monogamy and all that kind of stuff." And so like, even that, like really pegging my interest. A lot of students have invited me into their own journey as asexual students, where I hadn't come across many asexual students who identified as asexual in my early teaching career. They have I owe them like a tremendous debt, because I believe that we have this exchange relationship, that I provide materials that they might have not seen. And then they also will say and suggest other things, right? Did you see the what's the name doc on the interview? I mean, they introduced me to TikTok. They've introduced me, because I was like, look, I'm cool with Facebook, Twitter, and then Instagram was really pushing it. And then they tried to do TikTok, and then Snapchat. No, like, but there was information being disseminated on these things that they were being privy to, that they were aware to, that I wasn't. And so there are a lot of things. They taught me like Z, Zim, Zer pronouns for the non-binary children. Like, I mean, they've just really clued me in on so much, and so much that they've learned through their own experience living as queer, living as trans, living as non-binary, that they've learned. And so they have taught me so much. And I think that for me, even my confidence in teaching what I did, I owe that to like all of my mentors as well, like Dr. Ann Russo at DePaul, Dr. Francesca Royster at DePaul, like Leila Farah. I had so many great professors as an undergrad. I was completely disinterested in school. I was disinterested, and my dad was a professor, and he tried his best to get me into that. And he was one of my first and greatest teachers. And I was like, girl, I don't want to do this. I'm not interested in this. This is time to be with my friends. And high school was boring to me, and it wasn't. And I realized later that it was boring because I didn't learn anything about my history, my culture. I didn't learn anything about women's history, feminist history, queer history. Everything was this kind of rote memorization and teaching to a test. And it wasn't until I got to college that I developed a passion for learning and knowledge, and knew that that was the key for folks to think differently, because that's what it did for me. And I wanted to be that. I wanted to be that for another young person who was frustrated, who didn't know how to name their rage, who didn't know how to name their, discontent with what was going on in the world around them, because that was done for me, So they've taught me like so much. So.
That's beautiful. Well, Jafari, so full disclosure, Jafari and I have had a conversation on Busy Being Black, and Jafari is one of my Black queer theory gods, if you will. So Jafari, you know this already, but my introduction to you was through your essay, Black Queer Rhizomatics, in No Tea, No Shade. And it strikes me that this conversation and the various connections and complications that those on this panel explore is part of what you ask us to recognize as a Black queer rhizomatic. So for those who haven't yet been anointed by that essay, how might you begin to talk about our ability to seek what we need beyond our current moment?
Thank you, Josh. I have to tell everyone that it was a wonderful opportunity to talk with Josh. And even though we were in the ether and an ocean separated us, it felt like we were sitting on the sofa with the best gin one can imagine, talking about these things.
And we did cry as well.
And I told, so full disclosure, I will not be crying today, even though I could. And I could because what Cookie and Kaila describing is very much these connections between our teachers, our mission in life, and the people that we hope to touch, and the fact that this is a continuum, and the fact that it is not something. The reason that I use a rhizome, that is not a root going one way, but going laterally, that can sometimes go under, for example, concrete, or go somewhere else and you pop up and there's grass there, or there's an orchid or something, right? That what you've described is indicative of that. And one of the things that I have found, and one of the reasons my heart is full, right, as a teacher, is being able to see that in my students in ways that that my co-panelists have already described. And it is so different from the model, from the professorial model that we are given. because that is all about being impenetrable and being the authority. And what I'm hearing both of them talking about and what I experience is that the work happens at moments of vulnerability, right? Of being able to crack open. That is not to say that we don't have boundaries, but that we allow our students to see us as people who have questions, people who can learn from them. And this is, I think, our Black gay tradition, right? And one in which I think is also a tradition of certain streams of radical feminist teaching in classroom to do that sort of thing. And so, if the question is how can we do more of that, I think that some of that is in being vulnerable, admitting that we don't know everything, being able to say when you ask about teachers, you ask about how you got there, not spouting off, well, I went here and my degree is from here and I've won that award, but these are the people who nourished me. These are the people who talked to me. These are the folks who then, when I spoke, said, think about that again, and here's another way for you to think about, right? And I think that this is a great gift that we can give everyone who is searching to learn things, that this is a new model, another model to do, which I think is difficult. It's difficult sometimes because it's easier, at least, at my big age, right? To be, and also it's different because of my gender presentation, right? So I can be the old, wizened, gray, full prof and just sit and just talk and then leave, right? That would be cute for whom, right? I mean, so I think that in that essay, I try to talk about what I've learned from my students and what we can learn from each other following a path that goes back and forward and under and sometimes stops for a while, and then reimagined in other places of literature and music and art and politics that that we can talk to in classrooms, but we can also talk to, on the bus, on the tube, having a pint, putting on our eyelashes, right? All of those things.
Thank you. I'm curious, we haven't prepared for this question, so plot twist, but it just popped into my head, which means it's from the ancestors. How has your idea of what liberation looks like been changed by your respective deep dives into history? I'm just conscious that we're all in process, right? I was having a conversation with someone yesterday about abolition, and I was like, I'm an abolitionist except for that guy. You know what I mean? Like, not him. But that idea of what it means to be an abolitionist has changed for me, just as I encounter all these new people and thinking in new ways about what it really means, like the mechanics of abolition, and how much harder it is to live as if abolition were a reality now, right? And so I'm curious about, as you each dug into history, how your ideas of what liberation or even freedom or freeness have changed.
I'll say, Josh. So I'll just jump right in, so smarter folks can think and have something actually cogent to say. But I'll just jump right in because this is something I've been thinking about, and part of it is that in doing the work for Disco Ball, I was confronting the record, the literatures, and the archive of what the folks, many of whom I know, had left for us. but also my own limitations, some of which stem from what I learned from them. So when you talk about abolition, I mean, I've had that experience also, and some of it is being able, and that's part of the vulnerability, to say, oh, I've gotten to this part. Tell me more. Tell me more about this to see how I can move. Because when I was in graduate school, it was the moment of resistance. There's resistance everywhere. So my dissertation went around Cuba and was like, that's resistance. There's resistance. There it is. And that I thought that that was my mission. And then I reread Saidiya Hartman and thought, wait. Um, and then I talked to my research respondents in Cuba about what freedom meant for them, which is very different from what sort of material freedom, right? It's very different from what it meant or what I thought it meant. And that shifted it for me at that point. And reading back, just at the last part of of editing the book, reading through my own limitations and where there's an argument, but I can only go so far to that argument with that argument. Also let me know that uh, that is in the conversation around these things that we expand, right? It is so my understandings of freedom are shaped by coming of age, coming of age sexually in the late 1980s, right? And so some of those around being able to protect yourself from HIV, and or if you have HIV, being able to live a healthful life, being being able to avoid being pulled over and what could happen if by police, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'm confronted by a different form of this in Cuba. Then I'm confronted with a different form of this as I talk to friends who come from different class backgrounds, different places around the world and around the country. And my understanding of freedom expands beyond the sort of liberal notions of freedom that I was given, and that come out of my own experience and the experience of people that I know and what I had read up until that moment.
So again, always in process. I'm actually conscious of time, so we're not going to answer each of the, we're not each going to answer that question, because I do want to talk about desire and the erotic. Cookie, I have quite a contentious relationship with the erotic and desire, not for want of trying, right? I think like many gay men of my age, which is 21, I desire and the erotic has become rather distorted, right? And so I have been actively looking for ways to encounter the erotics or my own erotic energy for transformation, right? And so I'm curious about what example Black queer women set in the 1920s and 30s about how desire and the erotic can be directed towards something more generative and fulfilling, whether that's just intimately or much more broadly.
Yes, wonderful question. So one of my favorite examples in the book is this moment in which Mabel Hampton, who's a very important figure for Black queer women's history, since she did these really important oral histories about her life as a Black queer woman in the early 20th century with the lesbian history archives in New York. So oftentimes I'm using more kind of outsider sources to get at these women's worlds, but this is one of these special moments where I actually have an insider source, right? A woman talking about her own experiences. And she actually met her partner of several decades on the street, which I love because we often think of, the street as a place more commonly where men might have an interaction, right? thinking of the street, thinking of parks and other public spaces, which many women haven't necessarily seen as safe spaces for them to have, flirtations and interactions. But she was on this street in Harlem one day in the early 30s. And so this is the beginning of the Great Depression, right? And still the Prohibition era as well, this important overlapping moment that makes all these new queer spaces kind of emerge. And a woman came up to her and gave her a card for the rent party she was throwing at her house, right? And this was a way that folks were kind of pooling their money, kind of form of mutual aid in the Great Depression. So you'd come to a party and you'd pay, and that money would go towards the rent for the hostess of the party, and she would supply, food and drinks and things like that. And so one woman met and flirted with another woman while she was waiting for the bus, gave her her card. She went to this party, right? We don't know if she went with other people. She made this brave move to go to this party to meet this woman she just met. And the two of them connected and went on to be partners together for several decades, right? And so I just think it's this beautiful moment of, of desire and expression and agency on the street, and then the way it's connected to these kind of intimate queer spaces that are emerging in this very specific moment, right? We have the Great Migration bringing more people to the north. People are meeting in these kind of spaces that are only existing in this time of prohibition, and everyone's kind of enjoying breaking the rules during prohibition, right? So there's kind of this freedom in the air in this way, but it's still the Jim Crow era, right? So there's all these kind of, different power relations going on. So yeah, so these types of kind of unexpected meetings and moments of desire, I think are kind of liberatory moments. And I would probably connect that to that larger question about freedom and liberation too.
There was something similar here in the UK. In the 80s, these Black lesbian shebeens were hosted in places like Brixton, where these Black queer women would kind of gather and share and connect. And it reminds me of that as connected to that longer legacy of space making. Kaila, you are also an award-winning podcaster. Hey, friend. And have been doing the wonderful podcast Strange Fruit for a number of years. I'm curious about what you've learned about world building under siege from some of the people, themes, and topics you've explored on Strange Fruit.
No, yes, and thank you for that. I love the fact that folks who large society sees as marginalized or minoritized, are always in almost every epoch creating their own safe spaces amongst themselves and with one another. And like we've interviewed so many folks, and even to hear about in this particular show, to hear about a polyamorous couple who not only were, and they were queer, it was a polyamorous queer couple, and they would share space and notions of family with their other partnerships, even if those other partnerships also had either children or more partners. And they would kind of get together for barbecues and I wouldn't want to say happy hour, but definitely cocktails and conversation. And they would take shared responsibility with the kids as well. And I'm like, this is cute. You know what I mean? I mean, like, because when I think of those kinds of things, like shared responsibility over child rearing, I think of like, Warren Jessup, and I think of like, these kind of real insular communities that are insular and might lead to instances of abuse, harm, trauma, because they're so isolated from other communities. But in this sense, that exclusive space for them, right, as marginalized folk, as racialized folk, as queer and trans folk, was like this really liberatory, safe thing, and wasn't a thing that was meant to isolate them from other communities. In fact, it was meant to bring these different communities together in a way that was beneficial for everybody involved, sexually, romantically, familially, familially. So like, and I've and I've never thought about that before in terms of us being able to, of course, within gay life, you have notions of gay family and like, that's my sister and this is right and all that. But to actually like do it in this kind of physical, real, like, and then I want to say real, in this physical way, and not in a way that is like, a kind of ideological or intellectual or that kind of psychic connection, but in this connection we're sharing bills and we're sharing responsibility and love and sex and happiness. I mean, I loved it. And I tended to, I guess, think of that kind of communal living to just deal with like cis straight families, to be honest. And of course gay families, and of course the ball scene, right? But not in other types of ways that outside the ball scene, like none of these folks are connected to the scene or a house, but here they were making these houses, like living in these physical houses and doing this. They're doing these things, right? And it wasn't swingers, it was, so that's the thing I loved about podcasting the most, was exposure to communities that I just had no idea about, and possibilities that I didn't have access to, right? Because I think that when we have our imagination, sometimes that even in and of itself is limited. And I think that that's what I've learned through podcasting, through teaching. I thought my imagination, it was so expansive when it came to all those notions, freedom, like all this, and no, like it was still like limited and not, I wouldn't say narrow, but certainly more restricted than I literally thought I was until I've been exposed to these types of things.
What stands out for me about that is this question in my head is, what would your life look like if no one was watching? Right? And that these ways of living otherwise, the people are just minding their business and just building the house they want to live in, or just like building the family that they want, right? And there's that desire again, right? That through our desires encourage a practice or a rehearsal for the lives that we want to live together. I think that's really beautiful. Excuse me, Jafari, and there's a disco ball between us. You put forward both Black gay habits of mind and Blackfulness as a way of thinking and feeling our way through Black queer history. Can you say more about how Black gay habits of mind and Blackfulness help orient us towards the futures we deserve, while also being attentive to our aliveness in this present moment?
Thank you. So Blackfulness is Audre's, right? And the way that Audre Lorde talked about that notion of Blackfulness in an interview with Charles Rawle, she said she's talking about living in the Virgin Islands, and the fact that she is surrounded by and in community with Black people, and she says some who I like, some who I dislike. Some who I'm politically aligned with, some who I'm not politically aligned with at all, but in it and engaged with this. And what that does for me is to think about moving through a space in which we are at once aware that our histories and our identities do not make our politics necessarily, and do not say who our political allies are necessarily, and at the same time recognizes one way of orienting ourselves where we know that, as Zora said, all skin folk ain't kinfolk, but at the same time we'll try and try and try to make those connections and work through them. And that for me is a really powerful space to be in. It's a challenging one for a lot of people, and it's one that I've chosen for myself. And the Black gay habits of mind is a way to think through how the way that we've done business. So, many critics will sort of try to characterize a time period or characterize a school of thought, right? And one of the things that I want to do is to think through what it is that we received from the first generation of Black, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, non-gender conforming, and queer folks, trans and queer folks, who said it out loud and were trying to make community, and to try to discern what those habits are, what they moved toward, how they put the work together, what their sensibilities are, not to prescribe other sorts of things, and not to say that this is the only way, but to get clear on that, in order for us to then rethink it for our own time and our own place. And that's what one of the things I hope comes through there's a disco ball between us, that in the first part that I'm presenting what I think the sort of the shapers of the paradigm did. And I pose myself as a figure in there, as a young person trying to figure that out. And then we move on to some of the problematics of actually doing Black queer research. And the word queer comes up at that point. And then sort of the end, we think, okay, so now we have all of this, and what do we do with it? And I sort of leave you there in this moment in the 2020s, where we have so much to think through. And what I'm concerned about now, the work that we're doing now, is actually doing that in a different way, by rethinking Black queer habits of mind, by thinking through and organizing the 30th anniversary of the Black Nations Queer Nations Conference, which we're going to stage here at Columbia University in New York, with connections all over the world, right? So that's an opportunity to say, okay, we know we can clearly talk about what happened during the late 70s and the 80s and 90s, and the work of historians who have taught us what happened before that period, like Cookie's work and the work of other folks who are talking about the 20s and 30s, and even, as you mentioned before, right after abolition. Now what do we do with an intellectual and a political and an artistic tradition? What can we make of it at this current moment?
And we can evidence that right now. Kaila, you mentioned a love for Audre Lorde's Afrikete story. What does this story teach us about the intellectual, political machinations of this moment, the potential of this moment? Sorry.
Yes, well, one, I'm introduced to Lorde when I'm in high school. So my English teacher in high school clocked my tea, and she was like, "You gonna need this book right here." And I'm like, "Ma'am, this is about a lesbian." But it's so like, but I read it and I'm like, right. But and when I'm reading about Afrikete, so I find Audre Lorde's Tar Beach, where she has ended this relationship. She's really tore up emotionally about it. And she decides to go to one of those parties that Cookie talked about, right? This kind of gathering of Black lesbian women. And she talks about how she hated going to them parties because Black lesbians tended to be very dichotomous in their erotic presentation. Like, so there was always butch femme. And Lorde just felt like, oh my God, and everything. Like, she felt like these Black lesbians were so committed to that dichotomy, and she didn't feel strongly about either position. So she goes there. She's very poetic and descriptive of like the food there and everything. And she meets this woman. She says, this is a beautiful, gorgeous Black woman. She asks her name. She says, "My name is Afrikete." And she's like, "Oh, it's African." And she's all deep too. Like, what does that name mean? And she's like, "Girl, Black Pussycats." And she's like, oh, okay. So she had on this lipstick. The lipstick was called War Paint. These things like stood out to me, even reading it all these years later. And she just talks about her overwhelming desire for affectate. She wasn't somebody who was like, I prefer femmes, or my erotic type is only femmes. Like, and you know, we know, all know Lorde, that most of her primary partnerships were with that of white women. And so affectate is this figure, this woman that she writes about with such intensity and such passion, and such focus. And you know, I've thought to myself that this is actually not a real person, because you know, if I was Afrikete, baby, I would be like, where's the coins, Audre Lorde Institute? Where I'm Afrikete, the main daughter, and who Lorde is obsessed with and writes about. So where's my money for the legacy or something, some shine? But I think that it's her talking about her own self, talking about her own transformation, and how that transformation, moving from this intense relationship grief that's devastating and altering, getting to the erotic and connecting with that in order to transform out of that, in order to kind of like make herself a phoenix, in order to overcome in this way. But when I'm reading it originally, I think Afrikete is in fact this woman. They end up having this hot affair. They have all this sex on the roof. She remembers Afrikete's plants were like not taken care of. Like she had let her plants go. They were all like rotted. But she still thought she was so sexy and irresistible. And then Afrikete basically says, hey, I gotta go see my son. I'm going down south. Bye. And that's it. And it's just this quick thing in the summer. And I'm like, oh my God. And so when I'm reading this, I'm like, this is exactly what I want. My person that I meet, I want them to do this to me and disrupt me and interrupt and turn me into this Phoenix, honey, and overcome. I mean, it was so one, beautifully written. And then two, like I said, intensity. And I think that Lorde's real partnership, she writes very poetically and descriptively, but she's also like navigating through pain. And with Afrikete, even though there's the loss of her after this hot summer, because it is actually her, it's like a new version of her. So she literally uses the erotic as the kind of starting point in this piece, right? Like as the starting point to transform oneself. That's the ultimate way to connect with oneself and to free oneself, like physically, spiritually, emotionally. We know these things happen in our erotic lives. Sex can be, and desire, is such a liberatory thing when it's consensual, you know. And so when that consent is there, and I mean, it was there. I mean, I'm getting hot and bothered talking about it now. So anyway, Josh,
But like that, but this links to the conversation about the limited imagination, right? That even for those of us who cultivate an expansive imagination, the idea that we might be able to sustain that kind of erotic engagement with ourselves and with other people is actually, for me at least, it's like a little at the edge of the imagination. It's just beyond that scope. But in thinking about what kind of capitalism and indeed the kind of like dominant gay machine does, is it clips that erotic, right? It clips the erotic imagination too, right? And distorts it in so many ways so that we don't tap into that like deep liberatory work with each other. I might have just made that up, but that's how it feels for me. We're almost out of time. And we'd love to hear about projects that you're working on and excited about now. And then we'll have one more question to close. So, Cookie, what are you working on that is exciting and enchanting you right now?
Yeah, so my first book just came out. I'm still kind of, figuring out what the next monograph is going to look like. But in the meantime, I am working on one related piece, a chapter that's actually looking at some of the same women I've been writing about. Well, I guess one would be Mary Burrell, who was the playwright who was Lucy Dixlow's partner, and also Angelina Will Grimke. And I'm kind of looking at some of their writing, and also the fact that they were some of the first women to write about anti-lynching, like in their writing in the 1910s. And I think also Alice Dunbar Nelson wrote something similar. So it's kind of getting at the issue. Is it just a coincidence that some of the first writing we have about anti-lynching is all done by Black queer women? And I'm kind of like gesturing towards how their work is really kind of akin to the 90s concept of reproductive justice, but in a much earlier era. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on at the moment. And also I was just so struck by the way Jafari referred to kind of Audre Lorde's generation as the first generation of Black queer women who said it out loud. I was really struck by that. And I just want to say to that, in Donald Bogle's biography of Ethel Waters, she says, "I was a lesbian and the best who ever did it." So just going to add that to the conversation.
Kaila,
Thank you.
oh, or Jafari, I don't mind. What are you working on that's enchanting you at the moment? Kaila.
I was waiting on Jafari. I was like, go ahead, Jafari. Well, I'm actually currently editing my last chapter of my book. It should be coming out on Beacon Press 2025 May. Lord. Okay, thank you for all the claps. I still haven't come up with the title as of yet. But it basically explores, like, it's kind of part memoir, theory, like it's like a real big mashup of my experiences and my thoughts, and just being like this kind of Black lesbian femme professor, podcaster, stuff like that. Y'all get the real description when it like come out and be released in the world. But in the meantime, I am working on this essay on this kind of upsurgence of Black femme visibility through mostly the work of Lena Waithe, with her characterizations, like in Master of None season 5, and then on the Miss Pat show. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that show. Oh my God! But they have the most fire Black lesbian femme on that. I mean, I'm thinking of Meg Thee Stallion, right? Who identifies as bisexual. We'll talk about her in the piece, but just what does Black femme, Black femme, like queer visibility bring us? What does that usher in? Like, because I know that visibility also equals vulnerability, also equals violence, right? But it also equals possibility, expansion of imagination, and also shift. I think that with visibility comes cultural shifts. So it still has liberatory potential as much. So I'm really going over that because, I hate the fact that the more visible LGBT folk, particularly Black LGBT folk, are, in some ways, more harm is brought, more violence is brought, more antagonism is brought, legislation is brought, right? All of these really dehumanizing things. And so I'm teetering on the value of visibility in the face of that, and what that visibility does for me specifically, and what can also do to other, Black femmes in that. Because, like, for me growing up, the only kind of window I had into Black femme identity was like the two, Gloria Naylor's, the two from Women of Brewster Place. You forgot to close your shades.
Hand me a warm towel.
Okay, to put down her book and bring you a cool towel. I saw you. Okay, that's my girl. I love that.
I
Anyway,
seen ya.
you and your nasty. Because of that. And then Color Purple, of course, with Suge Avery and Celie. And both pieces were in like time capsules for me, who's growing up and basically coming of age in the 90s. Those were very like old, like, Color Purple is set at the turn, the turn of the century. And then you have Brewster Place set, I feel like, in the 60s and 70s. So that, like the fact that now you have these Black femmes who are acting up and getting buck, like Tia in Lena Waithe's Boomerang, who is a sex worker, a stripper. She's trying to unionize the sex workers. She's trying to build her brand. I mean, I'm in love with all of it, but I know how precarious it can be. So that's a long thing to say. Nothing. I ain't working on nothing. I'm just still pontificating and thinking about what I want to write about.
Pontificating is work, by the way. It's it's a hard day's work. Jafari, for you, what's enchanting you at the moment?
Teaching is enchanting me. The opportunity to talk about texts and figures that I have loved, just as Cookie and Kaila talked about, and see a student encounter it for the first time, there's there's very little like it for me that is as enchanting as the first time somebody reads Just Above My Head, or the first time that they read Brother to Brother Words from the Heart by Joe Beam, and say, oh, I get it now, right? That is completely and utterly enchanting for me, and one of the things that makes my heart full. And what I'm working on, and kind of like Cookie, and Cookie has more to stand on because her book just came out. Mine is like is 2 years old, but I'm still like, okay, look, remember I did that. I'm not really working on a book now. I am working on Black Nations, Queer Nations, that very soon will be at a point when we can talk about the vision with other people, and really build it, which is coming to New York August of 2025 on the 30th anniversary. But also we're working on doing, or we've been doing screenings of the documentary Black Nations, Queer Nations, in London, in New York, next month in Miami, June in LA, also work in Chicago and other places. So a lot of my energy has shifted from what I do on the page to actually engaging another part of my brain, which brought me into the academy as an organizer. And so I'm doing that and realizing that pontificating may be hard, but it's a lot easier than herding cats and trying to make something happen and organize in the real world. But I am enchanted by that. And I'm also want to thank, and I interrupted to thank Cookie for that Gladys Bentley thing. And I misspoke. I didn't mean that a person said it for the first time, but that there is a project that we have together. And I think that moving beyond, my fixation, and now I understand as a fixation with the long 1980s through the work that Cookie and others do is really key, as well as thinking about how the contemporary, how a critical view of the contemporary that Kaila is doing, and that is one of the things that seduced me to being a cultural critic. People like Bell Hooks, who were talking about the films of the moment, right? That is something that is exciting and is enlivening for me to see other folks do it, because I don't want to be the one attacked in the comments. And so I will read, I'm happy to read what you say and be like, she was right, but I'm not coming to your defense in a Twitter beef, right?
Well, I adore each of you so much, and I'm really grateful that you allowed me to moderate this conversation. Thank you all for being here. Our attendees, our audience, we can't see you, but we can feel you. We'll hand back over to Suhaili to close.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you so much, Josh.
And we can't call it moderate because I don't think that Josh does anything, moderately. I mean, it's not moderate, just excelled.
Curate.
Thank you. Curate. Thank you.
Conduct. Sorry, we'll get. My Mercury is in Pisces, so I could do language all day, but we got this later.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to this incredible panel. I myself learned so much today. Your students are so lucky and blessed. I hope you will follow Kaila, Cookie, Jafari, and Josh, engage with their books and podcasts, and continue to be an advocate for queer Black history and storytelling. Thank you to each of you who have chosen to spend your time with us. Please, we encourage you to come back, join us for some upcoming programs. If you are in LA, we invite you to join us on Sunday, March 3rd for the opening of our traveling exhibition, Queer Justice, 50 Years of Lambda Legal at the Forefront of LGBTQ plus Justice at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. You're all invited. If you're in New York City, we invite you to join us on March 13th at the LGBT Center for a collaborative program with NewFest called Trans Justice, Then, Now, and Forever, a screening and a conversation. You can find registration links for these programs on our website at AmericanLGBTQ+Museum.org. I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter to receive information and updates about upcoming programs and museum news. And thanks again. Thanks for being here. Have a beautiful day. Remember that history is queer, and we look forward to sharing time and space with you in the near future.
Well, remember that Black queer American culture is queer American culture.
Period. Okay, yeah.
Dr. Woolner said it.
You heard it here first. All right. Good
Thank you.
evening, everyone, and thank you so much.